Well, I don't know, he may show up at some point. You can run it from where you are, if you'd like. We do have somebody online who's gonna be contributing to the meeting, so I think probably a good idea we get going and we can slip in late if they need to.
Okay, I'd like to call the meeting of December 7th, Planning Commission meeting to order. It's 6:06. Need to get the...
We can go to roll call.
Let's begin with roll call. Commissioner Henry Bartels,
Present.
Commissioner Ann Marie Brooks,
Present.
Commissioner Robert Preston,
Here.
Vice Chair Ray Kerr,
Here.
Vice Chair Michael Wyckoff, absent, and Chairman Mike Noble.
Okay. Is there any public comment?
I'm here.
No public comment?
Somebody get this?
Oh, Eric?
Oh, it wasn't? Oh. It's hard to break in these new guys.
That's true.
Sorry about that. Commissioner Eric Gaither. Present.
Present.
Approval of minutes.
Mr. Chair, I just handed out minutes from the last meeting. You really haven't had time to go over them. So if you'd like to hold on to those, and we'll get you minutes from tonight, we can approve both of those at the January meeting.
Okay. And how about the approval of the 9/28 minutes?
Were they in your packet?
I did not see them. Let me see.
I didn't know we were behind on those. We'll get them to you. I'll double check what's been approved and bring you everything that hasn't been. Make sure you've got it in time to read it.
Okay. And it's on the new business. Coastal Management Element Review.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is one of those kickoff meetings we do where we start to review things that you'll be voting on later. We want to talk about the coastal management element. In the past, the coastal and conservation issues have all been lumped together. That's how the state did it when they first adopted 162 many years ago. And it's become more standard to separate them, so we're going to gradually do that because you got some conservation issues that are not specific to coastal areas. So, but we want to talk about the coastal management element, the policies that we have now, how it should be amended to bring it up to date, and ask to remind you that back when we first developed this coastal management element in the comp plan, and some of those original policies are still there, or probably most of them actually. There was no discussion of sea level rise or the impacts of climate change or anything else, whatever the case you may think is. We all know, living out here, that the water's coming up. There's more of it, and the storms are greater, and everybody who lives here is at greater risk than they used to be. So we have a lot of science to cover to bring, in terms of just bringing the elements and the policies up to date. And it's one of those issues that are going to ask us as a community to make some very difficult long-range decisions and maybe changes in order to help facilitate or slow down change. It's very difficult to be such a small organization and group of people fighting such a big issue. But it's obviously very front and center of all of our concerns out here. Also, over the years, the standards that we apply to coastal development have become more and more extreme, actually, and more rigorous based on changes that FEMA is making and insurance requirements and things like that. So we will have to go back and look at all of those things to determine not only are we up to date and considering all the current issues, but also for the long-range planning, is what we're doing really making our community more resilient? And is the policy and the program we're living with sustainable? Can we keep this up? And what do we have to do to make it as positive a future as we can? So we also be talking about the Resilience Planning Grant for Parallel Flood Compliance is item B, and we're talking about these together because obviously the flooding has to do with the fact we're all living on the coast here. And we have a contract with the University of Florida to provide us with the research that goes into the grant for the parallel flood compliance, and I think that's a good portion of the presentation you'll be getting tonight. We really appreciate having access to the University of Florida's team because they pull experts in from all different fields, and so where there's overlap in other areas, we have the benefit of many experts weighing in on the project. So you'll see a little bit more of them over time. But we have with us tonight Jerry Murphy, and he is the lead consultant for the UF group. And I think I'm talking as long as I can, Jerry, here. You trying to get everything running. And I think he's also got input from Russ. What's Russ's last name, Jerry? Larkins. He will be zooming in on the meeting as well to help us with the perspective on mapping. He's an expert up at the University of Florida that I've worked with too, and really, really helpful person. So, Jerry, whenever you're ready. Oh,
while Jerry's preparing,
yeah.
back to the coastal management element review.
Yes.
Are we, at some point, whether tonight or not, planning to go through section 3.7 that's in our comp plan now?
Yes. Yeah, we'll go through that all in detail and get your comments on it. And also, we wanted to make presentation and talk to you about some of the big ideas and elements first. I'm hoping that you have been reading them and making some notes and have, I know you've all got thoughts about it. It's kind of hard not to live out here and to live out here and not have concerns about coastal management and how local governments with as small as we are with our limited authority and budgets, what kind of changes can we do and what kind of policy can we have that impacts our movement forward. And I want to remind you here too, because this is probably one of the places where the rubber hits the road, and that is that policy has to be something that's implementable. And you can always have policy that says we will look for outside funding to assist, but you can't adopt a policy that says we will accomplish this if you have no way of paying for it. You can work towards it. You can have all kinds of creative ideas about things we're going to continue to pursue, but you can't get to a point where the community has committed itself to accomplishing something for which it has no authority or no funds. So we always have to keep in mind that when this gets to the commission, if they approve a policy, they also have to come up with a way that that's going to be funded over time. And actually, we're supposed to suggest that too, because remember, the comp plan all works together, and there's that capital improvements element in the back. We've all been talking about impact. The capital improvement element has to show where the funding's coming for any policies we adopt. So we always have to work within the realm of our authority and our financial. financial ability.
Russ, are you on?
Yes, I am.
All right, fantastic. Then we're ready to go. I just need to eject that. Stick that in. Oh, well. I'll do it manually. Good evening. For the record, Jerry Murphy with the University of Florida. Guess I need to leave this on. Just to kind of catch you folks up, in October of last year, the city applied for a resilience planning grant with the Department of Environmental Protection. They offer, these grants have for a couple years now, basically to assist local governments in implementing peril of flood legislation, which was legislation in a nutshell requiring local governments to address climate change, sea level rise, flooding, all of the issues that are associated with climate change. And we were successful in that application, and we were awarded, I believe, in July. We talked to you about this sort of initially in a kind of kickoff meeting, and now we're starting outreach meetings. The grant requires us to do at least 2 outreach meetings. We will probably do more just because the nature of the Planning Commission, Board of Commissioners dynamic, there's multiple meetings. And I expect we'll do 2, this one tonight and another one with a little more policy content, if the direction we get tonight is to do that. And then we'll do another one in front of the Board of Commissioners to sort of tell them what your recommendations are going forward. All right, now if I can get the page down to work for me. All right, so these are the project objectives of the grant. Doing a parcel level analysis of the housing structures, workshops to present the vulnerability assessment, which you'll be seeing tonight. Public participation to gather comments and reactions based on the policies that we're going to propose to satisfy this peril of flood legislation. And then we're required at the end to do a summary report to DEP of all of our methodology. So tonight we're going to go with a little statutory background and then a vulnerability assessment, talk about policy alignment and the workshops, and then the final report. So the vulnerability assessment, our goal here is to identify and delineate areas and populations that are vulnerable to flood hazards within the city. This, our initial public outreach workshop, we're going to review some things that we've reviewed with you before, but we have some new commissioners, so hopefully this will be helpful, and we have to do it anyway. The primacy of the comprehensive plan in Florida, the statutory requirements for this peril of flood legislation that passed in 2015, and some local policy tools that you can utilize as we start developing policy to implement the peril of flood requirements. And then we've compiled hazard inundation data, and that combined with the infrastructure vulnerability, it constitutes the majority of the vulnerability assessment. So the presentation workshops, the goal there is to engage the community so we inform them of the hazards. I think we had a EDA that just came by and did some information in that regard. Again, the draft policy language, and then the workshops where we'll get public feedback, do some information to the public, get some reactions back in terms of how we move forward and address this bugger of sea level rise. Then the final project assessment will summarize our findings, the vulnerability assessment, what we learned through the community engagement process, the draft policy language that will hopefully be recommended to the Board of Commissioners. And at one point we were going to try and align with other barrier island communities, particularly Treasure Island. They decided just after we were awarded the grant that they didn't want to participate in that. We are still informing them, though, as we go through the process so that they can benefit from, or not, the efforts that you all do. So the primacy of the comprehensive plan, as we've said before, under the Community Planning Act and under the Growth Management Act that preceded it, every local government in Florida is required to adopt and maintain a comprehensive plan. Everyone in Florida that isn't a new municipality has already got an adopted plan. And so the maintenance of that is doing the evaluation and appraisal every 7 years, which we're just beginning. This is the first element that we're tackling because we have a grant to do it. And then we'll go on to probably other elements, and I think Linda's given you a calendar, or we're working on one. And we'll probably end up looking at the land use element last, because that's sort of the major aspect of comprehensive planning, is how we're going to grow in the future, develop, redevelop. And then that'll all be transmitted to the Department of Economic Opportunity at the state for their review and approval, and they'll have a report that they'll issue. Could be a very positive report, could be an objections, recommendations, and comments report. That's down the road. That'll be in 2021, I believe. 2022. Okay, so the next year you'll be engaged in this evaluation and appraisal of the comprehensive plan. And all development has to be consistent with the plan, all the regulations have to be consistent, and all the actions that the city takes in regards to moving forward have to be consistent with the plan. And the local planning agency, which is you guys as a planning commission, are required to review all of these things and make determinations of consistency. And some of you will recall that we did an update and revision of your level of service standards. That was a comprehensive plan amendment that's been transmitted to the state. They have, I think, 60 days to review it. We transmitted in early November, so we should probably be hearing back from them in early January. If they find that that is acceptable, those amendments are acceptable, that they comply with state law, then we'll be able to go forward with the impact fee ordinances that you've also seen once. And Wednesday, the commission is having their first hearing on that impact fee ordinance. So this is kind of a similar thing, only this is with the coastal management element to make sure that it's consistent with the statutory requirements, and particularly with peril of flood. Comprehensive plan is legislative, so you are able to take input from anybody. It's not a quasi-judicial situation where you are not allowed to have ex parte communication. Here you're open to being lobbied by the citizens in terms of, what they think about these things that you see. I'm hoping that if technology suits us well, we're going to be able to have a web page that has this information on it so the public can be involved, whether they come to these meetings or watch on TV or not. There'll be a web presence that they can hopefully gauge. These are the elements of the comprehensive plan. The first 9 are required. There also are optional elements allowed. Our focus tonight is on the coastal management element, but also to some extent on the conservation element, because your comprehensive plan combines those elements as a conservation and coastal management element. And one of the things we're going to be discussing is the possibility, the option of separating those into 2 elements, and I'll get into that a little further as we move along. So there are 2 common components. There's data and analysis. These are the facts and conclusions that basically underlie the policies, and then the goals, objectives, and policies that are the actual legislative actions that your comprehensive plan requires everything to do. Data analysis is often maps and tables. You'll see some tables tonight. Not as many as we have in the analysis, just a few to let you know. Russ will be presenting that. And then, there's a requirement that it be basically expert type of data, and common sources are census information, which we've used in our vulnerability assessment, as well as the university's Beaver research and Schindler. And the comprehensive plan, after the data and analysis underlying it, is composed of goals, objectives, policies, and strategies. And these are the definitions from the statute of what those things do. Strategies are not defined. This is a relatively new thing, and local governments are dealing with it different ways. For example, Manatee County has implementation measures that they coined that term prior to the statute changing in 2011 to provide for strategies. You may recall when we did the LOS, Level of Service Standards review, we put some strategies into the comprehensive plan to implement some of the mobility. So the peril of flood legislation in 2015, there were a lot of things going on, particularly with the National Flood Insurance Program. In 2012, I believe, the legislature, federal legislature, passed the Bigger Waters Act, and some of you, since you live on a barrier island and may have flood insurance, may be familiar with that. But the idea was that the federal government was going to basically amortize the subsidy that non-conforming coastal properties got for flood insurance. And so the idea of Bigger Waters was to have all property owners paying the full cost of their insurance, full cost of their risk over time. And once that was adopted, there was a lot of pushback, and they revised it. And so at the same time, the Florida legislature was thinking, okay, we need to address this, because if everybody's going to have to pay the full cost of their flood insurance, they need to be aware of what their risks are. And so the legislature passed this parallel flood legislation, and it required, among other things, that the coastal management element include some new requirements. And these are those new requirements. Basically, the first three are the most important: addressing sea level rise, removing coastal property from flood hazard areas, from the special flood hazard area that is on the flood insurance rate map, and then to explore site development techniques and best practices to reduce flood insurance claims. The other three, consistency with the Florida Building Code, you have to do that anyway, but this provision does allow you to have requirements that are more stringent than the Building Code. For example, if you wanted to have a higher freeboard, I think the state now is requiring a foot. If you wanted to have 3, you could do that, and that would be a more stringent requirement. Coastal construction control line construction practices, you have to be consistent with Chapter 161, which you have to anyway, so I'm not exactly sure. The making of sausage is how some of these provisions got in there, but the second 3 are really kind of redundant. And you're, as a local government, you're supposed to encourage local governments to participate in the NFIP community rating system. And I don't know how a local government encourages itself to do that, but you're a member of the NFIP and you're part of the community rating system, so you satisfy basically all of those last 3. So we're going to move on to the vulnerability assessment.
Just say
Oh,
one thing about that, encouraging things. We do, a lot of that gets handled through the communications and outreach programs that you do. When we send out our letters and mailings every year, and then also participation in county programs for insurance. And we'll have somebody here tomorrow night, too, talking about it. So everything we do, gives people the opportunity to ask questions or find out more information about insurance. And that basically is mostly what we can do.
And that basically supports the community rating system. My criticism is the way that this is worded. It's directing a local government to encourage local government. I mean, I guess that would be if the county were to encourage its participants, but anyway, like I say, sausage. All right, so the vulnerability analysis background, we identify the infrastructure, land uses, and people who may be impacted by sea level rise. And as we go forward, just be aware that risk and vulnerability are often used interchangeably. And that vulnerability is basically defined by NOAA as the potential for loss or harm and damage from exposure to natural processes, land use decisions, and community resilience. Okay, Russ.
Okay. So my name's Russell Watkins. I'm the disembodied voice that is going to give you a brief overview of our vulnerability analysis that we did for Madeira Beach. And you've already heard the background already. So this is part of the requirements of the peril of flood, and it's administered by DEP's Resilient Coast Program. But then they also generously provided the funding for that. Just for a little bit of background on me, so you at least you know what the voice is talking about. I'm a geographer at the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies at the University of Florida. My background and my expertise is in spatial analysis, modeling, mapping, databases, data sources, and climate change and the effects of climate change. Okay, oh, so, right, I can't control the slides, so that's right, Jerry, sorry, you are my slide person. So that's, yes, thank you. So I just, very quickly, I'm going to try and keep this brief because I know you all have a lot on your agenda and on your plate in general. But essentially, The requirements from Florida DEP are for you all, for us to address the effects of sea level rise. But as you can see with peril of flood, there are other considerations, and we've expanded upon the minimum guidelines by including other potential flood hazards as well, including the 100-year and 500-year floodplain, which in fact in your area you don't have an issue with 500 years, high tide flooding, storm surge, and then this issue of social vulnerability. And I'll provide a bit more detail on each of those potential hazards as we go through the presentation. As part of this analysis, we've identified what DEP and NOAA like to call focus areas. We've identified 7 of those in the city, and those are, you can think of those as areas of heightened exposure to flood hazards. They potentially could form the basis for what they like to think about as adaptation action areas, where you develop specific policies to address the conditions and the flood hazards in those areas. One thing, and I'll try not to, hit this too many times, but it's very important that you're all aware that we use standardized, widely accepted, and widely used data from federal and state sources. Okay, so this is not anything experimental that we've come up with. These are things that are widely used and well documented nationwide, essentially. The innovation does come in, however, in how we integrate it and analyze it a bit. Okay. Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Jerry. It's hard for me to think and command you at the same time. Next slide, please, sir. Oh, did you lose me?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Could you get me the next?
Vulnerability analysis summary 2.
Yes. So, oh, okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, I can't always see it. Okay. So here, and I put this in the presentation so that you can see it, but these findings, these are the summary of the findings that are listed in the our task 1 report, which is essentially the vulnerability analysis. And one thing I sort of skipped over is we not only did we incorporate other flood hazards in this analysis, but we've also kind of gone a little bit beyond their minimum reporting requirements. So we have a textual document that summarizes the analysis, but we've also created this web-based app that will allow you to look at the data layers that we used for the analysis and get a sense of how they relate to each other and how they relate to the conditions in the city, and then also download that data in case someone wanted to do a bit more analysis. And I don't think we're really going to have time to go through that, but once we get maybe Linda and Andrew up to speed with that, they might be able to give you a brief introduction to that. And I won't belabor this. Sorry.
You should have a copy of that task 1 summary report in your packet.
Yeah, and so we can skip over this part for now. This okay. So the next slide, please. Right, and so what I've done, and just so you know, there are lots of graphs and data behind these things that will be available in the final report. But again, I didn't want to bog you down with too many details, but we put together a very quick sort of summary matrix of what the overall conditions are within the city in terms of exposure to flood hazards. And this is a very simple sort of ranking system of high, medium, and low exposure. And it means, intuitively just what it seems. These high exposure are areas that are exposed to multiple flood hazards in any given situation, right? And so what I've tried to do here is just give you sort of a quick summary of some of those things that are at, I don't like to use the word risk, but are potentially more vulnerable to flood hazards. And so, for example, if we look at the high exposure areas, which will comprise your focus areas, you can see that the current land use is dominated by condos. Some of the future land use is residential, urban, and institutional. City Hall shows up as a critical facility there, potentially exposed. And then just a kind of a highlight of some of the years of when structures were built. And forgive me, but I have more of a kind of a 30,000 foot view here. I'm not as familiar with the city as many of you likely are very much. And so you may be able to think about, as you see where some of these focus areas are, you might be able to relate when the structures were built to particular developments or characteristics and whatnot. And I think what's particularly important, though, however, in this matrix is to look at what the property appraiser and the Department of Revenue call just value, right? So that's the value of the parcels and the structures as assessed by the property appraiser. And so that particular factor gives you a sense of the sort of potential economic magnitude of a storm event or flood hazard event in these different areas, right? Next slide, please, Jerry. And so
around vulnerability analysis background.
Yes, we're good now, right? So one example here is, and this is a screenshot from the web app that kind of shows you the, and this is the basis for our analysis. This shows you the exposure of the municipal streets within the city. And it's a very simple, again, low, medium, high. It goes from cool to warm color. So you get a sense of those particular streets that may have some flooding issues now or in the near future. And again, I apologize. For me, I'm the data analyst. I'm not really the local expert, and so I can't give you a particular example. Okay, let's see. Yeah, so if we can jump to the next slide, please, Jerry. Thank you. Okay. And so I just wanted to take a minute again to kind of give you some, just the kind of framework of how we put this together, why we took the approach we did. We based it on the Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook, which DEP and NOAA put together. The whole focus and idea of this vulnerability analysis is the potential impact of sea level rise on people, infrastructure, and land use. And as I said, we've expanded that a bit. Jerry gave you one definition for vulnerability. There are many, many, as you can imagine, out there. We have, of course, our own slightly different, but consistent with NOAA's overall very general one. And that is this idea of exposure to flood hazards and the potential for damage from the same hazards, right? I'm trying to keep this very, very general so that it's not it's not super specific and limiting. A primary goal of this, I touched on that, is this idea of focus areas. DEP likes to define those as areas where critical facilities or infrastructure are located or where the highest affected population resides. And that's a very logical distinction and labeling there that, again, will lead to potential specific policies and programs to address the flood hazard potential. Okay, we can skip over the rest of this because I kind of already covered this. Thanks, Jerry. If you could go on to the next one. So where are we?
Tide flooding.
Yeah, did we skip over one already? Did I miss the vulnerability data layers? I apologize, it's a little different. Yeah, this is what I wanted. Yes, thank you. So again, harping on this idea of using standardized, widely accepted data. The base data layers that we used in this vulnerability analysis include, of course, the parcel database. That's essentially our base map for the city. It's the 2019 parcels from the property appraiser and DOR. We use the Florida digital flood insurance rate maps, right, from FEMA, sorry, for your area. The high tide flooding data that came from NOAA, essentially. Storm surge data that's also from NOAA and the National Hurricane Center. Sea level rise projections also from NOAA. And then this social vulnerability data that we have taken from a very well-known source where they have looked at a number of demographic factors to determine populations that are at higher risk to either flood hazard events or environmental events in general, right? And they consider things like age, race, income, education, health, household composition, those sorts of things. Okay. Right, so you can jump to the next one, please. So I just wanted to give you all a little bit of background on some of these terms that maybe you hear, maybe you know quite a bit about already, but they're in the newspaper all the time. They're very common, and so it seems like it's just handy to have a little bit more context on these sorts of things. So, for example, the high tide flooding data layer is based on a projection of exceedances of high tides over many, many, many years. But it's this basic idea of sort of combining the seasonal tide cycles with the effects of sea level rise, so that essentially tide ends up being higher than we're used to, higher than it's historically been. And we see that with this is a very common picture you'll see from South Florida. They're really suffering from that sort of thing down there. It's based on NOAA flood frequency data. And these are projections. They're not always, they're based on actual events, but they are projections. So that's important to keep in mind. Okay, next slide, please, Jerry. Talk about sea level rise projections a little bit. So same idea, the sea level rise data is based on this, for your particular municipality, is based on the St. Pete tide gauge. NOAA requires that there be a period of record of at least 40 years so that you can establish a trend in sea level values over time before you can begin to project those out. And so what we've done is we're using the latest, greatest from NOAA, which are actually woefully out of date, unfortunately, but it's 2017 data. We're using the intermediate high projections because those are consistent with the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program guidelines, and they're also consistent with the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel recommendations. In particular, what we've chosen for our analysis are the years 2040 and 2070. And I realize that sometimes that only going to 2070 is a bit of a limitation when you're trying to obviously plan longer term. But what we're seeing, and without going too far into the weeds, but I'm happy to talk about it anytime you want to. What we're seeing is that, well, first of all, the projections are already under projecting, right? The rates have changed dramatically from those rates used in the 2017 formula. And that this idea of projecting too far out into the future is going to underestimate what the potential effects are. And so it's wise and I think actually quite conservative to use more near-term projections. And for example, again, not to go too far into the weeds, but this 2017 formula from NOAA is using a global mean sea level rate of 2.7 millimeters, but in fact, currently NASA is measuring that at 3.3. I know that 0.5 millimeter doesn't sound like a lot, but when when you sort of amortize that over time, it becomes fairly dramatic. So that's the basis for those particular projections. And those are also consistent with we're at least trying to be consistent with surrounding municipalities as well and jurisdictions to the extent that we can. Okay, Jerry, thank you. Could we go to the next slide then? This one's also very interesting. We hear about storm surge a lot. And again, this may be some of the things you already know. I won't go into all the details about how they project what the storm surge potential hazards are, but I find that this graphic in the upper right of the slide is really helpful, and it just simplifies things because I'm pretty simple-minded myself. But you can see there, the example they're using here is that the normal high tide is about 2 feet above mean sea level. If you have a storm surge of 15 feet, which I hope we never see in at least our side of the Gulf, what you end up with is 17 feet, a water level of 17 feet above mean sea level, which is obviously very dramatic. So it just sort of breaks down this idea of, what do we mean by storm surge? And so when the weatherman's on the television and there's a storm coming and they say, well, there's potentially, a 7-foot storm surge somewhere, that you need to think about that and add that on top of essentially the normal high tide in a given area. And of course, it's not actually quite that simple, but that at least gives you an indication of the sort of hazard that you're potentially exposed to. Okay, so that's enough belaboring the data. Next slide, please, Jerry. So what we did for Madeira was to take this integrated data where we looked at as I said, storm surge, sea level rise, floodplains, high tide flooding, and work out a sort of geostatistical method so that we could figure out those areas that are more exposed to hazards versus those areas that are less exposed to hazards. And that's what this hotspot analysis is. It gives you a statistically significant relationship between areas and the overall average for the city. So there's an overall sort of hazard exposure score for the city. And then we have areas that are much lower than that average and those that are much higher. Those that are higher have become the focus areas. Okay. And if you don't mind going to the next slide, please, Jerry. So that methodology, which also is widely used, is what yielded what we're calling our focus areas for Madeira. There are 7 of those. The colors don't mean anything except that it's just to highlight the different particular areas, right? Okay. Yeah, and I think for now that gives you sort of the spatial context of where those areas are that may need more specific policy program activity or not. But those are potentially problematic areas. Next slide, please, Jerry. So then what we incorporated into that focus area analysis was this idea of population social vulnerability, which I touched on earlier, right? And so this map, first of all, shows us that the bulk of the city is in what you would consider a low social vulnerability. And so that has its implications in terms of, income, education, et cetera. But the issue I have with this particular type of analysis is for the city of Madeira Beach is this social vulnerability index is based on census tracts. And so what you're doing is taking these various factors and, as you all probably know, averaging them across the tract. And so what gets lost in that averaging and this sort of smoothing, if you think about it, is potentially pockets within the city of more vulnerable populations, and that could be related to, again, housing, income, et cetera. And so that's something to just kind of keep in the back of your mind, that on the surface, based on this particular data at this scale and resolution, there's not really an issue from the perspective of social vulnerability, but this may not give the most accurate picture of that aspect. Okay, next slide, please, Jerry. And so, I have to throw some graphs in here so that you realize that we made them. So what we just put together some simple things just to get a sense of kind of the magnitude of these different focus areas, and this is more relative within the areas themselves. Focus area 5 has about 80 acres. That's really the largest one of the 7. Focus area 6 is essentially borrow pits and whatnot. So that's not really even an area that I think is going to be much of an issue from a policy perspective. I think probably the more important and more useful graph is the next one, please, Jerry, which will show us the focus areas as a proportion of the total city area, right? And so focus area 5, again, is clearly the largest one at about 10% of the city. Okay. And again, all this information, I'm sort of giving you an overview so you understand some aspects of the type of data that we've collected and compiled for you. But these graphs would be available for you to look at in more detail down the road a bit. Okay, sorry. So how about the next one, Jerry? So being from the University of Florida, we're required to have at least one slide with a certain amount of orange and blue in it, right? So that's what this very busy graphic is. I just found this to be kind of striking, and it's mainly because what it does is summarize what flood hazards are present in each focus area, right? And essentially all of the flood hazards are within these each focus area. And so that kind of is a very simple way to confirm the statistical analysis, which shows that the scores are high, the presence of these flood hazards are high in those focus areas. And so this essentially combines and confirms that information. That's really all we have here for you. We can jump to the next slide if you don't mind, Jerry, please. And so just like I did for the city overall, I just did a quick matrix kind of summary by focus area of some of the key factors to be considered. And we are limiting this part to specifically residential aspects, the current land use, and then things like the year built, what the structures are composed of. And then again, I personally think, but of course it's up to you to decide, that just value is particularly useful consideration in these different focus areas to give you an idea again of the potential economic magnitude of impacts from a flood hazard or storm event. And I'm not going to draw any conclusions for, beyond, we can see like the largest area is focus area 5, in terms of economics, it's really just the second, smallest potential economic impact. So but that's still, I don't mean to minimize that. I mean, I'm just straight looking at the numbers here. There's a whole different consideration if you think about who actually lives there and what needs to be done. Okey doke.
Russ, this
Yes.
is Russ. May I ask you a question? When was this data taken for this last slide?
So all of this information is based on the 2019 parcel database.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, Jerry. So can we jump to the next slide, please? Right, and so there's a little, because that's just my nature, I'm duplicating things because I hit the same points over and over again to make sure it's clear. But so the preceding slides you saw are the type of information that has been summarized in what we're calling task 1 or the vulnerability analysis report. That information will also be contained in the final report as well. But as I mentioned, the other thing we've put together is this web app that will give you, I think it helps to kind of flesh out and make real some of these graphs and numbers that you see. So you can actually see where things are, see where the issues are spatially, and then, sort of apply your obvious local knowledge and experience to get more of a sense of why things are where they are and what the implications are for those. So just put a bit of brief background here on this app and the scoring, which I really didn't spend a lot of time on. But this idea of low, medium, high is based on the number of flood hazards that are that any particular parcel is exposed to, right? And this is a very simple, very easy approach, right? So if you think about this, we take a parcel and we have a collection of polygons that represent the flood hazard, the different, flood hazard layers, right? So we're essentially dropping a pin through those different flood hazard layers and through the parcel. So if the parcel is within, say, the 100-year floodplain, it gets a score of 1. If it's not within the 100-year floodplain, it gets a score of 0. If it's within a high tide flooding polygon, it gets a score of 0. If it's not, it gets a score of 1. If it's not, it gets a score of 0. And in the end, we summarize these 1s and 0s essentially, and we have a maximum potential score of 7 because we have 7 data layers. And then we just subdivide 0 to 7 into the 3 categories of low, medium, high, right? And so if you think about that, the low zone, for example, would be somewhere, would have a score somewhere between, say, 0 and 3, something like that, right? And it's just additive as you go ahead. And so that's the basis for all the scoring. That's the basis for all the analysis, and that's what we represent very clearly, I think, in this flood hazard app that you will be able to look at. And Jerry, if you just jump to the last slide, then I'll stop blathering on. But this is what
Do we want to push our luck and try and see if the link would work?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to, I'm all for it. But this is what it looks like. This would be what you're confronted with. And in fact, Jerry, if you click on that slide, if you can do that, it should launch the app. And then we'll see if it works. That would be very cool. Yeah, how about that? Okay, and there you have it. And so there's this splash screen gives you some background on what this thing does and what you should and should not be using it for. For me, again, I focus on some very standard things. So don't buy a house based on this app or this data. Don't make any sort of major decisions in that regard. But it's very useful to get an indication of those areas that are exposed to a variety of flood hazards, and it puts them in a context that lets you look at relative areas, right? And I've tried to make it about as simple as you can at this point. And like I said, we should spend a little time with some of the staff maybe so that they're very comfortable with it. And I can't really see, I mean, I'm seeing some of the things, Jerry, but you can probably see them better than I can.
Yeah, I'm just turning layers off.
Yeah. And you can also just zoom in if you feel like it, you know, just for fun, just to, you know, you can just use the wheel on your mouse to zoom if you want. You can also use the plus and minus that's up there. Yeah, and so you can, as you all can see, you can get a very detailed view. You can get down to the parcel level and get a sense of, you know, what areas are potentially exposed to these various flood hazards.
I have a question. On one of the slides, the category 5 was 80 acres, I believe,
Yes.
but then it was valued at 22 million.
Yeah,
Yet,
yes.
yet category 1 was much smaller. It was valued at 275 million.
Yes. I thought,
I didn't understand that.
yeah, and so that's based on, and so one thing, what I haven't done, because I focused on residential for the focused areas, is I'm thinking, for example, in focus area 5, there's a lot of other uses that, you know, non-residential uses essentially, but this I don't know. But that would have definitely affect the valuation, you know, those just value sums that you see. Focus area 1 could be a, you know, concentration, I believe it was concentration of condos in that particular area. So yeah. So does that make sense to you? So the just value for the focus areas applies only to residential land uses, not to any, you know, any other industrial, commercial, mixed use, that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I would double check those numbers though, or not. I'm not.
Yeah, we're gonna refine the numbers. We talked about this earlier today with staff, and basically, we might be doing some double counting on condominiums, the way that the property appraiser categorizes those. So we'll make sure that we refine that.
There's, having done this and other types of studies over the years, I can tell you there's almost, well, absolutely always some kind of double counting on the property appraisers. So we'll look at that again, because that's usually one of the biggest portions of the analysis when I'm doing it, is having to weed out the problems in the
That data.
yeah, the data for the property appraisers. So it's very tedious finding where they've double counted and how they've double counted things.
Yeah, and that would be very, very helpful. I mean, again, you know, because for me, that's the value of this sort of presentation and interacting with you all, is to be able to put this stuff out there and then get your feedback for, well, wait a minute, that just doesn't seem right. Yeah, I mean, we don't want to belabor the issues with the property appraiser and Department of Revenue data, but there's a lot of them. So yeah.
Yeah, it's heavy.
Yeah.
Also, I just want to let you know, Russ, that this is all very sensitive issues to us here, and they do have kind of more of a sense of flooding, and we'll be able to provide you with more specific information if it's useful, because Tropical Storm Eta brought in what we're estimating at a 7-foot surge. And so we have levels that various streets absorbed, or, you know, the inundation levels on street by street. And that's been very interesting to see. And will definitely be data that will be informative as we move forward, thinking and looking at these. Now, you know, I saw the maps, and the surge and the levels street by street did align pretty well with exactly what your projections were. So, so they have seen the water.
Yeah, so that'd be great. Yeah, and that again, that's very helpful. So The limitation of using the standardized sources and the fact that they are projections means that sometimes they're very good, sometimes they underestimate, and sometimes they overestimate. So yeah, that'd be great if you have some additional data. Thank you.
Russ, this is Commissioner Preston. I have a quick question. You talked about a St. Pete tide gauge. Is that a philosophy or a database, or is there an actual gauge?
Oh yeah, sorry. That is the St. Petersburg tide gauge that's maintained by NOAA. Yes. Yeah, there's I believe 14 gauges around the state that are maintained by NOAA that are accepted and used for sea level rise projections in the state. And those are tide gauges that have a minimum of 40 years of record.
Is that easily accessible someplace?
Yeah, actually, yeah. There's a site that's called NOAA Co-ops, COOPS. If you just Google that, you can you'll get the web page. I mean, I can't give you the URL right off the top of my head, but yeah, it's NOAA Co-ops, and then look for tide gauges. You can search for St. Pete, and they'll give you the history of it, the location, the different datums, the sea level rise trends. There's a lot of really good information there.
And Russ, I have one other question.
Sure.
So a lot of this data is based on your tide levels on high mean tide, and there's also a high mean tide, and then we have what we call king tides, which are these tides that are just out of the norms and they come in on us. How are those tides indicated in your study?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, as you correctly stated, it's actually mean high water is what most of the projections are based on. I think Jerry might have mentioned that, and I probably didn't toss that term in, but that high tide flooding data layer is the king tide, sunny day flooding, whatever. There's a whole bunch of different sort of vernacular terms, but that's what that data is designed to get at.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so sunny day, nuisance flooding, minor tidal flooding, blah, blah, blah. That's also king tide. So I meant to throw that in there in quotes. Very good question. Thank you.
Any more questions for Russ? Okay, thanks, Russ.
Sure. I hope that I was helpful. And if you have any other questions come up as you review the material or talk about this, just please, let us know, and we'll see what we can do to help out. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Russ.
So the remainder of these slides, there's a lot of them. The content is for your information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. There's a lot of statutory stuff, but it's things that should be helpful to you as we move forward with the evaluation and appraisal and this particular element. So we talked about the presentation workshops, peril of flood legislation. I gave you some background on that. I'll go over the requirements, and I think that while the legislature always seems to be doing stuff to local government, I think in peril of flood they provided some opportunities as well as some requirements. And then we'll talk about your comprehensive plan and the two elements. So this is the bigger waters timeline that I was telling you about in terms of how this thing sort of rose to the fore in Florida. I mentioned that the city of Madeira Beach combines the conservation and coastal management elements. One of the things to be thinking about is, does that combination still make sense? The city of Naples recently did this same sort of a project. They had a grant a year ago, and they updated and they decided to diverge their coastal management element from their conservation element, so that one thing particularly is to follow the statutory criteria. As the legislature meets, they constantly tinker with Chapter 163, now called the Community Planning Act, And so there's always changes being made. When they make changes, you're required to comply with those changes. And your comprehensive plan, as many comprehensive plans throughout the state, are set up along the framework of Rule 9J5, which was repealed in 2011. So that guidance, that framework is gone. Now it's all in the statute, but it's not the same. It's been rescheduled, and so one of our recommendations would be to align those criteria with the statute so that when the legislature makes changes, you'll know where to identify them in your comprehensive plan, and you can make those changes accordingly. Currently, your combined coastal and conservation element has 3 goals. Under those, there are 18 objectives and numerous policies, but again, like I said, they're not aligned with the statutory framework. So your conservation element, the statutory criteria is laid out here. There are 2 sections of the Florida statutes that apply, 163, 3177, which talks about all the required elements, and then it has 163, 3178, which is specifically regarding the coastal management element. These are the statutory requirements regarding the conservation element. Its focus is on natural resources, and particularly the identification of where these natural resources are so that you can track over time whether you're expanding them or contracting them, if they're being impacted. The city is primarily built out, at least horizontally, so you don't have a whole lot of them, but nonetheless, these are data sources that are important to keep an eye on. Not exactly so much aligned with the coastal stuff. And then these are the different aspects that you're supposed to identify. Then it's supposed to provide principles, guidelines, and standards for conservation of this stuff, protect air quality, et cetera, et cetera. And again, because the criteria for conservation require one thing and coastal management another, we think it's better to keep them separated so it's easier to identify what changes happen in the future. Then regional water supply, you basically coordinate that with the water management district. And then we get to the coastal management element. And the coastal management element has 10 subsections, and basically they're focused on the coastal zone environment, species of wildlife and marine life, living and non-living coastal resources, trying to avoid any loss of these coastal zone resources, employing ecological planning principles to identify suitable permitted development, limited public exposure expenditures that subsidize development in the coastal high hazard areas, protect human life against natural disasters, preserve historic and archaeological resources, pretty standard stuff. And then in 2008, I believe, the legislature amended the coastal management element standard criteria to allow for adaptation action areas. And so those focus areas that we illustrated on the maps and that Russ was discussing have the potential to be adaptation action areas, and you can provide different criteria for how those properties will develop and redevelop in the future, taking into consideration all of these impacts from climate change. Then Chapter 163 through 178, which is strictly focused on coastal management, provides additional criteria, 8 particular subsections. The first one is more or less a preamble, and then there's a requirement for data and analysis. Obviously, your element's supposed to be based on data and analysis. It's an explicit requirement of the coastal management element, including a land use inventory map, basically sort of like the same map in the conservation element, but focused on the coastal aspects. Then an analysis of the environmental, socioeconomic, and fiscal impact. That's somewhat of the analysis that we've done here with regard to peril of flood and this grant. Existing drainage systems, hazard mitigation, beach and dune systems. And as you can see, the way the statute addresses these things, it's a component, a beach and dune component, a redevelopment component. And that's how we're suggesting that you align your comprehensive plan elements so that each component is identified and the policies that flow from that are all there in one place. The redevelopment component, and this is where the peril of flood provisions were added in 2015. The redevelopment component was initially a requirement prior to 2011 that you have a post-disaster redevelopment plan. That requirement has been eliminated, but a post-disaster redevelopment plan is a really good tool to have, and we just basically will recommend that it be part of your comprehensive plan and address these peril of flood provisions that I'll go through again pretty quickly. So principles for redevelopment that utilize engineering solutions, strategies to reduce flood risk, best practices to remove coastal real property from the FEMA flood insurance rate map flood zone designations, site development techniques to reduce claims from flooding and flood insurance claims, which I'm sure are going to be quite a bit after Ada. And then again, those second three are 4, 5, and 6, which basically just reiterate other requirements that are elsewhere in the statutes. Then there's a shoreline use component for the coastal element, designation of the coastal high hazard area, and criteria for mitigation of comprehensive plan amendments. And this is a very complicated, convoluted section that was added to primarily allow somebody to get a coastal project approved because they had the right data. It shouldn't be of major impact here. Then a component with regard to providing public facilities, basically call this a concurrency component. The public facilities to support development will be in place as the development occurs. Again, your situation is primarily at least horizontally built out, so you would be looking mostly at redevelopment. Identifying some regulatory and management techniques to make all this stuff happen. And then the rest of the provisions with regard to the coastal management element are mostly associated with deep water ports. That's one issue you don't have to deal with here. There's an exemption for federal and state highways that have been approved, that they don't have to satisfy the requirements of the coastal high hazard area. Again, deep water ports. And then a requirement that a county will establish a county-based process for identifying and prioritizing coastal properties to be acquired. That's generally the local mitigation strategy where those are identified. And this is that comprehensive plan amendment, the requirements that need to be in place if the city were to consider amending the comprehensive plan to allow greater development than is currently allowed. And then appropriate mitigation as part of that. And this is hurricane evacuation. Again, this is applying to basically the counties. Most of the cities in Pinellas County go with the county's evacuation requirements. And so currently, as I mentioned, the conservation and coastal management elements together have 3 goals. We think that goal 1 is focused primarily on the requirements of the conservation element, and the goals 2 and 3 are focused mostly on the coastal element, and that's how we would begin to separate those goals, objectives, and policies along those lines. So what we'll be doing moving forward, align those current GOPs with the statutory framework, if that's your direction, basically tracking the provisions of the state statute and aligning those GOPs to fit within them, separating coastal from conservation. Then, as we did with the level of service standards ordinance, we'll be editing the policies for plain language, anything that's obsolete or redundant, and we'll be doing a renumbering. As we mentioned during that discussion, each element of the comprehensive plan starts the numbering over again as it currently stands. So you have multiple goal 1s, you have multiple objective 1.1s. That can be very confusing, particularly if you're trying to write a staff report, finding or recommending a finding of consistency with the comprehensive plan. So we have begun the renumbering of the entire plan with that first major amendment that we talked about, the 54-page ordinance that we discussed a couple months ago. So this is the first goal, and like I've mentioned before, we understand there's overlapping considerations between coastal and conservation, but if you separate them, it allows for better statutory tracking as things change over time. Goal 2 is guidelines for development, and given the growing complexities of the statutes, it's just going to be more practical to organize those elements along the statutory guidelines. And then finally, a post-disaster recovery goal, and we think this harkens with the peril of flood legislation, and so deserves to be more manageable going forward as we address the evaluation and appraisal report. And so this is sort of the statutory crosswalk that we'll do. We'll identify the statutory provision, associate that with a goal. You will probably end up having two goals for the coastal management element, one being regarding the basic requirements of Chapter 163-3177, and another goal that will address the overarching idea behind 3178. Then we'll identify a particular statutory provision, i.e. a component, as I mentioned, and below that we'll organize the objectives, policies, and potentially some strategies if they are, something that we can develop as we go through the process. So then finally, the last part of the grant is this final project, assessment and report. We'll summarize our findings. It'll include the vulnerability assessment that Russ went over with you. We'll talk about how we dealt with the community engagement process in the era of COVID-19, which is very tricky, which is why we're hoping that the webpage will provide for another layer of outreach, and then draft policy language for recommendation to the Board of Commissioners. And the alignment among the barrier islands is not gonna happen. And these are the tools that I was mentioning that you might want to consider about. Obviously, there's regulations. There's the potential for land acquisition, and you currently have policies in the comprehensive plan that talk about supporting the state's acquisition program, conservation and recreational lands program that the state had. Now they have Preservation 2000. So you can work with the state if there are opportunities to acquire lands. Density transfer provisions, those can be potentially within the island if there are higher places that could stand more density as lower places go underwater. You want to provide for that if that's something that you're interested in. The other option to consider, and this is a much longer range exploration, would be working with Pinellas County to identify mainland areas that might become receiving zones for entitlements or density as that becomes more vulnerable to sea level rise. Financial incentives and penalties, little carrot and stick. Obviously, the land use analysis and permitting process, as we start looking at these focus areas in terms of what happens there moving forward. There's a number of calculations that need to go in on both the private and the public sector. On the private side, you want to look at return on investment. Are you going to be able to be dry and above water long enough to get the return on your investment? Is that a good investment? And from the public side, do we want to continue to repair, install infrastructure as it becomes damaged based on different flooding events? Post-disaster reconstruction decisions, you're dealing with that right now, but it's a major issue in terms of substantial damage, assessment, and making a decision on whether to rebuild. Obviously, if they're substantially damaged, any repairs or rebuilding would have to comply with the current regulations that you've adopted under the National Flood Insurance Program, which generally involves elevation. And then capital improvements, obviously, where we're going to invest our money, if it's going to be vulnerable or not. And that's sort of the long view. You'll have the PowerPoint available to you to go over at your leisure. And it outlines all of those Florida statutory requirements. You've been looking at the conservation and coastal management element over the past week, I think, with regard to the packet. And so as we go forward, we will probably make a similar presentation to this. Again, we'll condense it to some extent. It's, again, for the benefit of the public. And in that next presentation, we'll be bringing to you, if it's your direction, that realignment of the elements and the statutory sort of layout to show that you're complying with all the requirements of the statute. And I'm happy to take any remaining questions.
Are you looking for a recommendation or a vote tonight to be able to
I'd like direction to either yes or no go forward with the statutory alignment. I think that's the primary thing. You know, if that framework seems suitable to you, then we'll go ahead and go forward with that. If you don't like that idea, you want to keep the two combined together, you know, we can do that as well. But I just think in dealing with these parallel flood implementations, it's really an effort, particularly in larger areas, and you have a pretty robust coastal management comprehensive or conservation element in terms of numerous policies, goals, and objectives. It's just an easier way to find stuff when the legislature makes changes to comply. So that direction would be basically what we're looking forward, and the willingness to have another workshop with the LPA in advance of one with the Board of Commissioners.
So basically asking for your input on separating out the coastal and the conservation elements so that they align better with the way the statute now lists all the requirements of comprehensive plan. And as a staff, I'd recommend that we do that. I think it's easier to keep up with legislation. It's also a lot easier for the state to review. And you always want to make it really clear for the state to review, and it limits the amount of input you have later to deal with. And then in regards to more workshops, I think it's natural that we would come back and present things in the manner that they're then prepared.
Yep.
And
Actual language.
yes, the actual language, obviously, you're going to need to really look at that, make input into it as well. And we need to, collect input from all of you before we actually start writing things, and hopefully can get some input from the community by setting up opportunities online for them to comment, to review the data. I would also like to review the section on the property appraisers data and look at the issues that you brought up tonight to see if we can identify any duplicatives and make sure the data is clean.
Yeah, focus area 6, Russ is looking at data basically. He's not made any visits here, but that's the little mangrove island. I don't think there's any borrow pits out there that I'm aware of, but the way that the Department of Revenue classifies things often defies reason.
Yes.
And they don't always know. They're often looking at aerials and things like this up in Tallahassee, and so they don't always get it right. So that was one thing that stuck out to me right away, is that wasn't identified as current land use correctly. It's basically a vacant mangrove island. Yeah.
Just straight, because we actually do update that every year and check if there have been any changes in parcels or anything. So that's part of the census we do with the Department of Revenue. Another little project y'all never get to see. And you can thank your lucky stars for that. But we have to evaluate every parcel and see if anything has changed each year. So I'll look at that too when we do our next report to them.
Are there any comments on that?
I agree with separating the two. Will we go through item by item on this in the workshop?
Yeah, to the extent that you want to.
The only reason, when I read through it, there's a lot of things that we say we do that we never do.
In the current element?
Yes. There's things that's there that we should enforce that we don't enforce. And so there's things that I look at that if we're not going to enforce it, we need to get rid of it. Or if it needs to be there, then we need to enforce it. There's things like this that I think are true issues, and there's the monetary concern of a lot of these policies that are in here that the city just doesn't have enough money. It's a grand idea, but there's not enough money. And we're only going to have one workshop on this?
We can have as many as you like.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
Within reason.
Yeah.
It's a big chore, and this one is particularly complex. and, detail-oriented for the coastal element in particular. So, some of the other elements may go quicker for us, but we do have to pay whatever attention this one demands of us. It's kind of the driving element. In a lot of places, they don't have the coast to deal with, and it's land use that drives or transportation that drives. But here, we are completely vulnerable to the coast and the way we interact with it. So this is our driving element.
And it
Yeah,
could-
this one has a huge financial impact to our citizens.
Exactly.
These policies right here, whether it's the community as a whole, as the city as taxpayers, or individuals themselves.
Right.
So what we decide here is very important, and I would say that once you get some of that stuff out, we're gonna get, if anybody's paying attention, we're gonna get some feedback from it.
I agree.
There are other things that we should bring forward as part of the consideration as well, and that is making sure that you all review your floodplain ordinance. Because although that's in the land development code, there are requirements that we have to live by in that floodplain ordinance in order to keep our CRS rating and just to protect our properties that need to be grounded in the coastal element and the way that we interact with the coast and shoreline protection and everything else. So we have to be aware when we're changing anything in the comp plan that it has a ripple effect. Eventually, we have to go back and update all of our land development regulations, our development code, to match or support the comprehensive plan. So we don't want to put policies in here that we either can't implement because they're too expensive, as you're saying, or because they end up invalidating something that we're otherwise obligated to do through the regulations. So we'll make sure that you have all that. And you know, as we're talking about it, we always discuss all the issues too, what the long-range implications are, policy by policy. It's a tedious process. We've been through it. It's almost like creating a new comp plan, which you haven't had to do since '87. And now is a very time-consuming process, getting all those policies in place to begin with. And because the circumstances have changed so dramatically since those were put in place, not only the legislative requirements, but more importantly, the environment that we're living in and the science that we have available to us, and just our knowledge of what's really going on out there. It's changed so much that we really are creating a new plan. And so it does require that kind of attention.
That's why I was thinking that just one workshop is just not gonna be enough to get through some of this stuff.
Yeah, we'll take our time. We have some grant deadlines that we have to work with, but those are minimum requirements, and so once we've satisfied those, we can talk about it more. I think it's very important that you're starting out the EAR process, the evaluation appraisal process, with the coastal element, given the geospatial context of Madeira Beach, and that can help inform what you do with the land use element moving forward, because you don't want those two things to be conflicting.
Right. So some of these things you'll see show up again when we
Yep.
do the land use element. The policies have to be consistent throughout, and they marry together definitely.
Or they will.
They will, yes. Right now, they did initially, but there's been so many changes over the years. And we just have a better sense also of the kind of regulatory power that you need to have as a local government. When we first did the comp plan, we were doing it because the state required you to. You didn't have one before that, and then they had this minimal level and list of policies you had to include, and that's basically what you started with. And very few communities intentionally added extra policy or added extra elements to that. They did it just because it was required, but the situation is different now. The community's kind of grown up. You know, our problems have matured with changes in the environment and also in changes in what you are required to do legally. You know, the process of government, hearings and everything else, and the involvement of the community the implications of changes you make in one element to another and how that works on the ground. We've learned a lot as a community, as, you know, you've kind of moved into a new era here of regulatory requirements and legal requirements weren't even as stringent back then. This was over 30 years ago. So it's a different world, and both environmentally and legislatively. And it's time to recreate your image of yourself and your future in the plan. And the first one, even as minimal as it was, I can tell you, I was here in hearings till midnight. So some of those workshops, we didn't have as many of them because there wasn't as much time to work on them. We didn't work on it for 2 years the first time, but we were here late, hour after hour, going policy by policy and that. So you can expect, you know, it's better and healthier to break it up in a number of hearings than to sit here too late. But yeah, it takes a lot of time to do it right.
A quick question on when you talk about what we're required to do, and the county requires certain things that the city has to do, the state requires certain things, and then probably the federal government requires certain things as well. But probably the state more so than in. When we discuss some of the things, I guess, what would be, it'd be interesting to know what the penalties are involved if we don't do these things. If there has been cases where the cities have been fined or revenue has been pulled back or whatever the case may be because these things have not been done.
Sure, well,
because once we go through this, that would be something very important that the commissioners, the city commissioners would, information that they would need to make these policy changes that we suggest, I guess.
We would definitely keep that in mind all the way through. Always let you know these are, you know, we don't just let you wander off on your own and create policy without a framework or understanding the legal context within which you're acting. So typically when we bring to you a set of proposals, we're always going to tell you this is the minimum you have to do to meet these requirements, and you can go further or you can reduce this a bit. These are the implications for that, but we'll always will tell you what all the legal implications are. And we aren't in the habit of bringing in anything that's going to cause you a legal problem. So sometimes it may seem that staff's bringing in something that seems kind of, why would you want us doing that? We say, well, you know, just like the floodplain ordinance, are there any changes that you contemplate there? You know, this is what you're going to need to do to keep in the CRS. And if you change that, you've lost the program. That's all. Everybody pays more insurance. You don't get grants. You can't get a mortgage. I mean, we'll tell you what the implications are. Most of those for the coastal element are going to be basically what we already understand with the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. And yeah, if we don't participate in that fully, there are definitely implications, and we'll let you know.
Yes, and as you go through the coastal management element, combined element, if you identify those areas where we don't do this and we can't afford this, identify those and let us know, because that we need to address that.
So what is the process then? Do we, assuming the commission recommends that you do split the elements, do you split the elements and then we review each of those elements, or do we review the combined element first?
Well, you should familiarize yourself with the combined element. As we separate it out, we're probably not going to eliminate any of those policies. That's policy for you to recommend and for the Board of Commissioners to decide. We'll just arrange them the way they are, reword them if they're not worded very well. If something is obsolete, we'll take it out. If it's redundant, we'll combine it.
Okay.
Try and reduce the number of pages that particular element has. It's like 15 now, and for a small community, that's a big element. But we may decide that all that stuff's important to keep. But as we realign it, I think we're gonna find some redundancies and some overlaps that we can combine to sort of reduce the quantity of stuff. But basically, your direction tonight will direct us to go ahead and do that. We'll go policy by policy, basically. I think that's what you want to do, which that makes sense, in the workshop or workshops. And that will result ultimately in a recommendation from you to the Board of Commissioners for them to take certain action with regard to adopting new elements or changes in the element that then become, basically, we put them in a queue as we go element by element, and then by December of 2021, we have to submit that to the state. That's our deadline.
Okay.
And then
Well,
you have a year after,
May
May?
22.
May 22, okay.
But when you back into all the hearing processes and everything, you know, we obviously really want to have it in order by December anyway.
And this thorough review that we're going to be doing in conjunction with the EAR, that you all are going to be doing, that really has not been done since Linda was at the Regional Planning Council, I would say.
Okay, well, we were tasked to review this last meeting. I didn't know if we were gonna review it tonight, or if that's gonna wait until a workshop.
Well, we're going to reorganize based on the direction, and then do a workshop with the reorganized goals, objectives, and policies.
Go ahead and review them and keep your notes, because it's all the same stuff, we're just
Right.
separate them out. And they're actually, they may show up in more than one policy, just as we said would happen with the land use element as well. But I think it'll be clearer, because there are some conservation issues that are not specific to coastal concerns, and it can kind of confuse the issue. In this case, the whole city's coastal, but I think we just need to align it with the statute, and honestly, it really goes a lot better if they recognize it up in the state. You know,
Yeah, no, I would agree with staff recommendations and Commissioner Preston.
We'll go policy by policy for them. We'll go ahead and schedule that and get ready for it, get started, because we've got lots of elements to cover. These are not the only two, but we'll go ahead and schedule that.
Other than the peril of flood compliance, there should not be substantive changes, but for something that's obsolete or something that's redundant. The substance of the element will remain. It'll just be reorganized. And we'll do a crosswalk, so you'll know what the
Right.
prior number was and what the new proposed number would be.
And also, we will pull out the section from 163 and provide you so that you can see the list of things that it requires you to do.
And that's in this PowerPoint presentation. I just went through it real quick because it's kind of boring.
And I'll double check too with the region and the county, because I know the county has the same regulations we do, but last time the crosswalk included a regional policy review, and I don't know how much policy they've updated. There used to be a regional plan.
Yeah, there still is, but it's 2005, I want to say. They're behind.
They're
the
behind
region.
as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I asked about that because the current reference is to that 2005 plan. I said, what's
Oh,
the
it is.
current date? And they said, yeah, we're working on that, so.
All right. Don't like there to be surprises.
Okay. So you'll be scheduling these workshops?
Yes, we'll, we had looked at a schedule, and what we were trying to do was schedule these for your regular meetings. But sometimes there are gonna be big plans and things to review as well, and, we can, as long as they're workshops and you're not taking a final vote, we can have them sometimes earlier in the day separate them out or have extra meetings. Anything you're voting on has to occur after 5. What is your sense for all of that in terms of having enough time to go through it? Unless we have, big plans coming through for you to review, like a PD, something of that nature. Typically, your meetings are pretty light, and your regular meeting time would be good, too.
Yeah, that's fine. I personally just have I'd like to start a discussion on the whole stormwater drainage system.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the way the residential properties drain into the streets, and then you use the streets stormwater management system for all the properties.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a city such as this, it's gonna have these ongoing issues, that's inundated. That's in my personal opinion, I think that we really need to look at that, because, you know, which came first, the chicken or the egg, the residential property elevation or the street elevation? And I think that they need to be independent, where you have stormwater drainage from the properties that may feed into those same lines, but not into the street to make it into those same lines. And it's a big discussion, it's a big expense, and it's one of those things that you mentioned you can't mandate in a comprehensive plan, but you could at least get the discussion going to consider grants to move in that direction. You know, the work out on Crystal Island is a perfect example. We showed in this slide here, this presentation tonight, Flamingo being a red zone, and before construction started, I brought up to the engineers that this was a major issue. The sunny day flooding needed to be independent of the stormwater management. The tidal flooding and the stormwater management were two different things, and I was told the planning, the engineering had already been done, and then there's nothing we can do because of the elevation of the residences on Flamingo. So we're going to spend all this money, we've spent all this money to have Flamingo at basically the same elevation, where we could have looked at other engineering solutions and raised that a bit. And I think, you know, we had the storm come through the other night and Gulf Boulevard was shut down. Now, I know that that's state roads, but again, you can't have street elevations based on residential elevations being able to drain into the street, to drain into the storm. That's my opinion. And I think that that's a big discussion that needs to have some time spent on.
It's a big one. So we've talked about that one all along. As you know, at some point, the local governments are going to have to make a decision how to deal with the engineering problems that come along with sea level rise and even just high tide, because it's becoming an issue more regularly, and because we know we're looking at inundation over time. Some of the issues, but those really are big policy issues, because there have to be, if we're going to take a policy direction on it, there has to be an engineering solution as well.
Right. And that's why I'm saying the inland properties, they don't have any choice. They have to drain to the stormwater underground piping. It doesn't have to flow onto the street to make it into that piping. And in my opinion, you can't mandate an elevation of a street level based on the surrounding property levels. I think that's the tail chasing the dog.
We'll have to talk about that, and also about the liability associated with flooding lots, because if the local government comes in, raises the road, and then it can't receive anymore because the lots are lower, then they've created a flooding issue onto those properties, which is effectively a taking. So it has to be a pretty thorough and complex engineering solution that prevents any flooding from low-lying lots.
I agree, but I think
without having bought those
I
lots.
think it's possible.
So we'll definitely bring the people in, and it's going to show up again when we do the stormwater and facility elements, because we actually have to talk about those engineering issues, not only in coastal, but when we talk about facility elements. And, you know, I warned you all that when we got into this, it's gonna be some really difficult and uncomfortable conversation because we're planning for things, we're supposed to be projecting out for at least 20 years. If, in this case, I think we always need to be looking further because everything we're doing now is going to have major implications on whether the land is even usable, you know, in the 20 and 50 year and beyond timeframe. And that if it doesn't affect all of us directly, it does affect people who come after us who own the property, and, you know, our own family members potentially, and the value of everyone's property as time progresses.
Absolutely.
Those are really difficult conversations.
One of the slides mentioned that the transportation is one of the major considerations.
Transportation is, because of the cost associated with it, because of evacuation. But, you know, lots are really not usable if you can't get to them. And other communities have already begun this process, the planning process down in the Keys. They've been trying to figure out what to do with it. They've done studies to determine exactly how much it would cost to raise the roads, and the cost was prohibitive to, well, all governments who have looked into it. It's just astoundingly expensive to raise the road level and the drainage system. And then in doing that in any way that doesn't inundate the properties next to it. So far, it's been, the local governments have realized there was no way they could afford it. And if you ask the state or even the federal government to come up with the money for that, you're asking them to come up with the money to do that in every single coastal community. So it multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. The cost is not something the federal government has any anticipation of paying, or any, I mean, they don't even fix the roads they own, but are not planning to put that kind of investment. What they have been doing is in places where the property is very expensive, they're buying the property so that people will move out. That's what their solution so far has been, because that's cheaper than raising the roads. Unfortunately, if the property is not very expensive property for like affordable and lower income housing, as they see it, lower income is anything that's affordable, they have not been bothering to offer to buy it because the insurance risk is lower for them. So they've been more interested in buying high-end properties because the insurance payout on those properties is so much higher. So there's a lot of politics that goes into making decisions about what gets funded and what, you know, what will be available for funding and how it affects the overall value, not really of the lots, but the loss value to the local, to the federal government in the insurance program. That's what is driving a lot of that decision making. As you said, it's always going to come back to what they can afford. But we will need to bring people in to talk to you about what those engineering studies have found and what the engineering solutions may be available. And if people have ideas on different systems that would work, by all means, we need to investigate that. Because people are always inventing and coming up with a new idea, you know. And there are some communities that have put in drainage and pump systems that have saved some intersections and some low-lying roads and gotten the water back out. That's also an option.
I would say many of the properties are waterfront properties, and they could provide drainage directly into back, you know, tidal,
Right.
or stormwater back into the intercoastal.
Now, at this point, too, I know it didn't used to be done, but I can tell you that now, when people come in and they're redeveloping property, we do require them to drain out to the bay, at least a portion, the back portion or half of the property. And so we're no longer expecting the whole lot to move into the street and then pump it back out. So we're already implementing those kind of drainage changes.
I was just told 6 months ago or whatever that tying into the stormwater drains underground was prohibited. I think that needs to be addressed.
Mhm.
and thought out, and is that an engineering solution that makes sense?
Mhm.
But I know tonight you didn't want to go that deep into it, but it's such a huge concept, I wanted to put it out there for thought.
I appreciate that, and yeah, we knew that was gonna be, up for discussion, and we need to bring in the experts to be able to answer some of the specifics about the engineering questions too.
And tonight, are you looking for any recommendations as far as splitting those two elements? I mean, I don't know procedurally
Well,
what you need
I think
from
if
the
there's a general agreement,
commission.
we'll be making a recommendation to you I would have just brought it to you that way, and Jerry's been really kind to ask if you were comfortable with that. So, and once you make the decision as the board that that's the way you're gonna present the element, we don't have to go back to the commission and ask for permission, because you are the LPA, you're the local planning agency. So you prepare the plan, they review it. So if you as a group seem comfortable with that, if you'd like to vote on it, that'd be fine. Or you could just give us a sense of consensus if it appears you're all comfortable with it.
Are there any other comments? Does someone want to make a motion?
I'll make the motion that we move forward with splitting the two.
You're not on, Bob.
Oh.
Your mic is not on.
Well, it's coming from,
Eric.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Eric.
I couldn't tell.
It's the mask thing.
Yeah.
Just hold it a little bit closer to you, they don't. There you go.
I will make a motion that we move forward with splitting the two elements. You might have to guide me with some verbiage for,
And reorganize them along statutory lines.
and reorganize it along statutory lines.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Can we have a roll call?
Commissioner Henry Bartels,
Yes.
Commissioner Anne Marie Brooks,
Yes.
Commissioner Eric Gaither,
Yes.
Commissioner Robert Preston,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ray Kerr,
Yes.
Vice Chair Michael Wyckoff, not here, and Chairman Mike Noble, also not here.
All right, thank you.
Chair, as far as the workshops, I don't know the best way to work that. I'm available most of the time. I don't know what your, we have an end date when we have to get it done, or we present it to the city commissioners.
I'll bring the schedule back to you again next time. We'll come in, next month with some, more information. But I'll go through the schedule one more time and, get that all out to you. And we'll make sure that there's enough room for discussion. If we need to propose some additional meetings, then we'll do that. Usually, like I said, it's gonna work better because some people work if the meetings are in the evening. We can start them a little bit earlier for the workshops if you'd like, but 6 o'clock gives people most time, some time to eat and get home. So what we had done in the past is have like an interim meeting. You typically meet on the first Monday, so on the, say, the third Monday, we could schedule workshops if we need to get some extra in, if that sounds like it's workable for you. That way it's kind of consistent with your normal meeting schedule and things that you have planned throughout the rest of your life.
Yeah, but you'll propose that at the next meeting, what day?
We'll bring in a full schedule proposal.
So I guess we're finished with that element of the,
Thank you.
and, is there any other old business? We've already had the staff presentation.
Well,
or is there another?
just on an administrative level.
Okay.
I did want to let you know, and it's late, we'd all like to go home, but just quickly, we did talk about this flood we had. The staff's been really busy collecting enough data and trying to get input from the community on exactly what happened and the level of damages. And by and large, people have not been willing to come in and ask for any input from the city, report any of their damages. And that's definitely hindering the amount of assistance we can offer and also how much assistance we can get from FEMA. Tomorrow evening, we're having a town hall meeting here to hopefully attract the interest of all those people we know were damaged. We put the announcement out generally on all of our social media, but then we also did an individual mailing to property owners that we know had damage, or we know had inundation. And it may not have been much, but we know they had water because we went around and checked water lines on everything. And trying to encourage them to come in. Also, they need to report their damage through the county's site, because that's what FEMA looks at to determine whether they should come in and help. We do have Representative Linda Cheney coming tomorrow evening. She was here today doing some site visits with the mayor. We're the only ones that contacted the media and got a couple of news reports done about how much damage and what the communities had suffered, because it seemed that after the storm went through, nobody paid any attention. It didn't show up on the news. We know that there were at least 370 plus houses that had water inside of them, and that the damages are ranging anywhere from, $5,000, and it may not be even anything that they claim, but $5,000 through the most extreme we've heard so far is up to $120,000 in damage, and that's going to cost the whole house. That's our concern, that there are people who are living in things that are no longer structurally sound. That's a good possibility. We've seen wallboard come out and things riddled with termites, and the structure doesn't even hold up after the boards come down. There's mold and mildew behind people's walls, and they may not even realize of that until they pulled it out. There's rot in the wood, and there are signs that some houses are sitting low enough that the water table comes up regularly enough now that it's actually keeping their slab and their block construction wet, which of course leaches into the wood in the walls. So we're seeing a lot of mold that predated the floods. And sometimes you can go in when somebody does want you to expect you to walk in the house and it pulls you over the smell of the mold and the mildew in it. So very concerned. We've also seen wiring that was not only outdated, it wasn't properly installed. The conduit is rusted all the way through. They're very dangerous situations, and people are working around this, doing their own fix-it jobs, not realizing how much danger they're in. We're really hoping that people do show up and ask the questions. We've got people coming, as I said, Representative Linda Cheney, she's trying to get FEMA actively involved to get some additional housing assistance done for people who can't stay in their homes anymore, and also to find out, what other kind of assistance is available. We know only that FEMA has a $30,000 grant that it can make for people who are either taking their house down or raising it up. Typically, it's not worth raising it up once you've paid the price for that, but that's one of the options that they allow. Also, the county officials from EOC are coming tomorrow. They will talk about insurance and insurance adjustment and about flooding and what options are available for reconstruction and restoration. So we want to get the word out. We would love it if you come. It's not going to be a meeting, so you're just coming as regular citizens, but I do hope that enough people show up to take advantage of all these experts being here and let us know where they stand. The estimates we've done based on water levels, and they've been proven out pretty accurate every time somebody comes in for a permit or a demo, puts the total damage at over $8 million. That's a really substantial thing that nobody's talked about, because this is just one community. there's a lot of people out there that are living in unhealthy situations. So, again, you know, as community leaders, when you do have a chance to talk to your neighbors, if anybody's suffering, if anybody's got any damage they haven't reported, it very worthwhile for them to let us know. Also, they shouldn't be doing work without a permit. You know, unless all they're doing is putting new carpeting down, if it's construction, you need a permit. And FEMA has some regulations or recommendations on how much wallboard you take out based on what level of water you had inside, and you know, dealing with your outlets and things like that. They really need to make sure they're using a licensed contractor and they got a permit for the work. So, wanted to update.
Linda, that was one of the things I'd like to follow up on. You know, I don't like the permit police, but this is something that becomes a safety issue for the whole city of Madera Beach with these people that are doing work on homes. When you pull that out, like you were talking about, and the structure is rotten or the conduit is non-existent, and what I foresee is a lot of these places just wham bam getting them done and then selling them.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a hazard to somebody else. So as much as I don't like it, is our code enforcement running around looking at stuff that's being pulled out and stuff?
We're voluntarily allowing or sending out our building officials and our code enforcement people to do an inspection, because if you're going to apply for grants and aid, you need a really good photographic record. And so we're doing a video walkthrough in houses to be able to provide that to people. That also gives us the opportunity to look to see how much damage is there. And those people obviously already plan to get a permit for whatever they're doing. But yes, any place where we can see work going on that's not permitted, we're going to have to stop it. We did allow people to go in and just rip the board out, because you got to get it out to dry right away. Those who just locked it up and walked away have even more problems now, because, you know, 2-3 weeks worth of mold and mildew is deadly to the thing. So we didn't run around looking for permits, but if they need to do more demo work, they need to let us know. There's no charge for that permit, but we do want to make sure that everything's being properly. And yes, if it looks like they're doing construction, then we'll put a stop to it just to quickly get them in to do the right kind of permitting for the work and make sure that it's not a problem.
And it allows you to walk in to do a pre-inspection before they do the work, doesn't it?
Yes, of course, yeah. That's what we're doing every time now.
Okay.
But again, that's for people we know are working. But yes, if it appears somebody's working, then we will stop them, and then we get to go in and look at it. You know, it's not just about the individual. If your house gets on fire, it endangers everything else around it too, you know. And nobody wants their neighbors' lives to be at risk, or, you know, nobody wants that. I mean, in some cases, we had people reporting that, you know, when the waters came up, you know, they were getting out of a house and in water that was rising up close to knee level, and the lights were still flashing on and on, so the power was still on. And, you know, fortunately, they got out of the houses before it hit the outlets, but that's the #1 cause of death in a flood, is actually electrocution. So just
in that
most people know about.
Yeah, in that aspect, do people know that when they leave or they see the water coming up, that they should turn the main breaker off at their panel or whatever? Is that something that we advertise to people?
We send out, you know, I turn mine off just because the wind gets high, because I've lost 2 air conditioning systems during big wind events. But when we send out all kinds of mailings and instructional things on how to prepare your home and what to do in case of emergency. And I don't know if you've taken the opportunity, but on the community development web page, you know, in the city's page, we have the flood information page, and that's providing you with all kinds of assistance and information, including a month-by-month activities that you can use to, throughout the year, get prepared for every possible emergency scenario and disaster. And, everything from insurance through what do you do to prepare your property properly, and then afterwards, what do you need to know about after the storm and when to go back in. Everything's in there. We can provide all kinds of information, but honestly, it doesn't really sink in until you've experienced something. That's the way we learn. So we try, but
And I can speak from firsthand. I mean, the water came from halfway from our driveway into our house in about 20 minutes. I mean, it came up so quick. It wasn't expected. They talked about maybe a 3-foot surge. We're 3.5 feet. We'd be fine. All of a sudden, it started to come in the house. The last thing I thought about was turning the power off. I mean, it was run across the street, wading in water this high to get to our neighbors who have an elevated house. So even though you can plan as much as you want, when it's right on top of you, all the planning goes. I mean, we threw as much as we can on the floor, up onto the couches and the beds and everything like that. But it just came in so quick. All the planning that we ever did just went out the window.
we were definitely at a disadvantage. All the emergency advisories that had gone out like 2 days before showed that the only flood warnings were in Jacksonville and Miami, which didn't make any sense because it had to pass over us to get to them. But, we weren't supposed to be hit by anything that big. And when the warnings finally came out that it was between a 5 to 7 foot surge, the rain was already coming down, the wind was up, there wasn't any time to change direction. And a lot of people didn't have the opportunity to get out. They really had no expectation. So I know people just, some went to bed. They woke up in the middle of the night because there's water coming up to the bed level, and they had to get out as fast as they could. So we were definitely at a disadvantage. That's something that I know the county's looking at because they really manage the emergency notification and planning process that we all participate in. And it was a dangerous situation. There were people in Reddington Beach, I know, in some cases here, but people I know in particular in Reddington Beach that had 3-foot waves slamming on their sliding glass door. So then it's not even safe to walk out into it because the wave action could carry you away. So it was a frightening situation. It really was. I tell everybody, although a lot of people here are going to lose their house entirely and have to rebuild. And most of the times they know that, they call in. But sometimes they just don't want us to know. But that means they're living in a house that's not structurally safe anymore. But I tell everybody that this, if it had hit earlier in the year, when the winds were higher and the water was warmer, it would have been that big one that we've all feared. And we need to take this as that small heart attack that warns you, that you got to change your lifestyle. This is the moment to lose weight and get all of your life in order, because, the next time it may come earlier in the season, or we obviously aren't built to sustain the brunt of a big storm. And it's not just with the housing, although that's been the primary focus. We didn't have too many businesses damaged, actually. But I think I'd mentioned to you before, we've got some land use issues, too, to address, like down at Johns Pass, where if it had been taken out by a big storm, we couldn't build back. The economy in this town would not be able to be replaced because everything along Gulf and then the village has been downgraded by the county zoning or land use map. So we have to fix all of this stuff, and we need to do it before the next hurricane season. There are a lot of things. We've also learned a lot about response afterwards, because typically what you do in permitting is you plan to do rapid review, and so we're all set up to do that, to get people their permits and get them out, and then nobody came. I mean, honestly, hardly anybody's still come in after we know at least 300 houses had water in them. And we've had most about 20 permits It's that. And, so, oh, there's so much work going on, sure, we know that, but nobody's come in to discuss it. Nobody's gotten a permit. So the rapid response from our end of permitting wasn't what we had to do, and next time we'll be on the street looking for it. And we're gonna mobilize teams and use staffs from other departments, because there aren't that many of us. And, we did get out and we did immediate tours, but again, there aren't that many of us. There's one, we have one certified floodplain manager and one building official, one code enforcement officer, so we're gonna have to train to create teams of people who can get out immediately and do surveys and measurements and talk to people while they're ripping the wallboard out, so that we have a sense of exactly what happened. But we have created more information than any of the other cities have. The fact that we're having a town hall meeting is apparently a unique thing, because it's the first one, and the county called and wanted to participate in it. They invited themselves to participate, and to use it kind of as a run-through on what they have to do elsewhere in the county, because nobody else called meetings that provided the level of information that indicated we really need some additional funding and help. So, we will take a different approach to data collecting next time, but we can't force our way into people's houses unless we see something's happening illegal, having to track what's going on, where the trucks are. We picked up all the debris. The city got through and picked up all the debris very quickly. So there's that.
In a situation like this, they don't have to know where the information comes from, but your people in the garbage,
Yes, yeah.
they are your first line of defense against things being looked at, because they know what has come out of these places. And if they see wiring and they see drywall and they see all cabinets and all these other things, that tells you that something else has to go on.
Most of the stuff that's come out has been the base drywall. We didn't see much in the way of wiring. People haven't pulled their wiring, and in a lot of places where
it's too expensive to
even
throw
the
away.
Even the cabinetry, they're probably going to pull it out later, but they have to get their adjuster in to look at it first. And that's part of the timing thing too, is that people needed to get the wet stuff off the ground and get it out right away, so they could dry it out and it wouldn't build up mold and mildew. But they haven't started big renovation for the most part. They had to get their adjusters to come through first, and then they got to find a contractor if they're going to do it legally. Then they pull the permit, because usually the contractor pulls the permit, and that's going to take some time. There's a big demand for contractors right now and for that kind of work. So most of what came out were pieces of furniture and bedding and carpeting, which we wouldn't worry about anyway, because you can put new carpeting in without permits, or the baseboard and a certain amount of drywall. We know there's a lot more to do, because the people who are now coming in asking for demo permits, they need demo more than that. They're going to have to redo their kitchen entirely. Or, as I said, a lot of people who are in stick-built homes that are up off the ground may have suffered catastrophic loss, because if the water was sitting up, even if it didn't come all the way in the house, if the base of the house was in water, then now all of their structure is warped and their floors are popping up. So it's flooding's confusing. You can look in some place and not see where the damage has been, because it's all hidden. It doesn't take the roof off, and it doesn't necessarily create as much debris until you really get into it later and do the full renovation.
Thank you, Jerry. Linda, quick question. When they consider the 50% rule, is that include kitchen cabinets, bathroom cabinets, and all that stuff as well, or is it just the structural portion of it?
Yeah, it includes all renovated areas. what we're doing to try to keep the values down is, we're calculating the drywall based on how high up it is on market rate. So if all you're doing is taking out the drywall, we're only including the market rate of just getting that out, the ones back in. We're not counting the whole house as needing renovation, because that's a whole different level of, development, that would cost a lot more. But if you've got a gut and rebuild the kitchen, then we would just include that portion as redevelopment, not the whole house. So we're trying to be really specific, and, we use ICC numbers, which are way below market value for getting that work done. On the international construction, council, there we go. They produce updated estimates on what it costs for particular kinds of construction, and the numbers are usually quite low compared. For instance, renovation is maybe $45 a square foot, whereas if you try to buy it, it's going to cost you a couple hundred. But we use those same standards across the board so that we're consistent all the time on everybody's project, and that's what we're doing. Just piecing out just those portions that have to be completely renovated by that number, and the rest is just wallboard cost. And we don't count the cost of flooring. Take care, because a lot of people who are tearing up their flooring are discovering that underneath whatever they have now is all asbestos, and they don't realize what they're dealing with. And even when you tear up asbestos tile, the mastic underneath had asbestos in it as well, and that's even more dangerous because they're walking around on it for a while. They got fans blowing throughout, so there are some pretty potentially dangerous situations out there. Some of that stuff in the black mold can, and especially, other than lung damage in adults, it can create brain damage in children. So we're very concerned about things that people are just putting up with in their home, not realizing what kind of long-term damage they can do.
I don't have any more, and I know people probably want to go home, but these topics that we're discussing right now are some of the policy issues that are in this document.
They are, the moment-to-moment on how we deal with these things are not, but yeah. Those things are also addressed in the floodplain ordinance, which is why I mentioned that kind of go hand in hand, and it ends up implementing our coastal element. So we have to keep in mind looking at that both directions, and I'll make sure you get an updated copy of that, because we do amend it every now and then, too.
I don't think you mentioned what time your meeting is tomorrow?
Oh, 6 o'clock. Yeah, 6 o'clock here, and we're going to have a general session to introduce everybody, talk about, the issues generally, take questions that pertain to everybody, and then we also want to break out in the city center room and set up some tables. So if somebody has just insurance question, they can ask the insurance person, or, just floodplain issues, they can go to that person, or just building code issues, Frank will be here to answer questions. So we can kind of separate people and let them move around and get specifics about their own property if they want to do it that way.
So the format's going to be separate tables. It's not going to be like a general discussion like...
We'll all be in a general discussion first in this room.
Okay.
And then we'll set up a system where everybody can break out if they got specific in person.
Okay. All right. So we're moving on then to, I guess, Planning Commission discussion is passed.
Yeah, nobody asked anything to be put on the agenda, so.
Right. Next meeting is January 11th.
Actually, I think you would have to make that decision, because I think it's scheduled for the 4th, and,
I think that was already postponed to the
discussed
11th.
because it's too close to the holiday.
All right, that was in a previous meeting.
Okay, thank you.
That's it. We will adjourn. Thank you.